We should be placing people at the center of our climate actions, particularly the most vulnerable people, so that we address inequalities while also increasing resilience to climate change. We're going to start off today's policy seminar with a series of presentations focused on the findings of this report, and then we'll move to a panel discussion focused on the solutions for more inclusive climate action. We're also excited to hear from all of you. So please do type your questions into whatever platform you're using to view this event today, and we will have a period for a Q&A after the panel discussion. Before we dive into the presentations, we'll hear some opening remarks from Máximo Torero, who is the chief economist at FAO. And he will be joining us via video message.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, esteemed colleagues, and all guests, my name is Máximo Torero. I am the chief economist of FAO, and I have the great pleasure to introduce our recent report, The Unjust Climate, measuring the impacts of climate change on the rural poor, women, and youth. Let me start by thanking IFPRI for hosting us today, and thank you all for being here. Colleagues, we often hear that the poor and marginalized are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but there is little cross-cutting evidence on the magnitude of this vulnerability. This report aims to fill this gap by rigorously measuring and monetizing the magnitudes of these impacts on people who are too often overlooked in global climate discussions: the poor, women, and youth in rural communities. Climate change is not just an environmental change, it is a matter of social justice. The report's title itself speaks volumes about the injustices regarding the causes and effects of the global climate crisis. We know, for example, that people living in low and middle income countries contribute the least to the greenhouse gas emissions, and yet they suffer the most from impacts of increasing temperatures. We also know that inequalities within countries are large because differences in environmental conditions, access to resources, and opportunities make some people considerably more vulnerable to climate change than others. This is what we normally call as bad initial conditions. But despite these realities, this report is the first to provide concrete global evidence on the magnitude of the challenge posed by the climate crisis for rural people who are in socially and economically vulnerable positions due to their welfare status, gender, or age. This report was a significant data effort. It uses households and individual-level survey data merged with geo-referenced temperatures and precipitation data to measure the effects of extreme weather events and long-run changes in temperature on welfare of rural people and how these effects differ based on welfare status, gender, and age. The analysis represented in the report is based on data from 24 low and middle income countries over 100,000 household level observations. The welfare indicators analyzed in the report, including the total household income, agricultural income, and non-farm income, were harmonized as part of the Rural Livelihoods Information System, the RULIS initiative, being led by FAO Statistical Division. This initiative is a public good that provides comparable indicators based on national representative surveys, data for a large and growing number of countries globally. An important innovation of this report is the indicators that were developed to identify extreme weather events for a large diversity of countries and agricultural systems contained in the report. These indicators use daily temperatures and precipitation data to identify extreme weather events such as heat stress, extreme precipitation, and dry spells based on monthly thresholds that are defined by long-term averages at a granular spatial level. The advantage of these indicators is their ease of replication anywhere in the world and simple interpretation compared to more commonly used temperatures and precipitation indexes. Colleagues, with this system in place is where initiatives like the FAO-led innovative facility on shock-driven food prices to strengthen anticipatory action and rapid response to avoid food crisis, just approved by the G7 leaders on Saturday, declaration becomes of crucial importance. Because these vulnerable people are the ones that will be affected. So we need this type of elements and policy reaction through this type of facility to be able to respond, not ex post, but ex ante through anticipatory action. The evidence in this report also paints of a sobering picture of the extent to which the welfare of rural women, rural people living in poverty, and other rural people are more adversely affected by climate stressors than of less vulnerable groups. As you will hear, the report shows that poor households lose 5% more of their total income each year due to heat stress than better off rural households, while female-headed households lose 8% more than male-headed households. Moreover, extreme weather events are causing women and children to work more, both in farm and non-farm activities. By monetizing the differences in income losses generated by climate stress on diverse rural populations, the report demonstrates clearly the magnitude of the funding gap between available climate financing and the needs of rural people. For example, it shows that across all low middle-income countries, heat stress is leading to a $37 billion a year reduction in the income of female-headed households compared to male-headed households, which dwarfs the roughly $10 billion a year climate financing that is reaching small-scale producers. This is why FAO earlier this year launched a global initiative encouraging a broad range of partners to commit to grow equality in agri-food systems. This is how we need to start to react to all this evidence to be able to put policies in place. The initiative calls on all of us to enhance gender equality and women's empowerment in agri-food systems through increasing financing, investments, and partnership, and especially in the most vulnerable areas. Colleagues, our findings highlight urgent need to scale up financing for vulnerable rural populations and to advocate for climate policies that are more people-centered. It is hoped that this evidence helps to guide ongoing efforts at a country level to reformulate nationally determined contribution documents in ways that prioritize people and their diverse needs. It is also another important input for our roadmap to SDG 2 and 1.5 degrees Celsius, where we're trying to show of the importance of the agri-food system to provide the right to food, but also that we need to find ways to increase efficiency so that this is sustainable, what we call good food for all for today and tomorrow. And we need to look at the differences across gender and across youth to be able to create the policies that are needed to be able to create this transformation. The report also provides an empirical foundation to advocate to more inclusive and integrated climate policies and investments, which tackle the multidimensionality of the risks and vulnerabilities faced by different segments of rural population, both and off of the farm. This report presents additional evidence that poverty and hunger cannot be eradicated without confronting the ramifications of climate change on the livelihoods of marginalized rural individuals and communities. We must act now to prioritize addressing these impacts and ensure equitable access to resources and opportunities for all. It is not acceptable that given the importance of the agri-food systems, only 3% of the climate investment comes to agriculture. That needs to change abruptly because it's the sector where we provide the right to food and it's the sector where major gains in efficiencies and the distribution can create a significant impact over the variables which are central to accelerate climate change. Again, also is a way where we can target these vulnerable populations more. In closing, I want to express my gratitude to all of those who have contributed to the production of this report and to each of you for joining us today. Together, let us commit ourselves to a future where climate justice is not just a goal, but a reality for all. Thank you very much, and apologies I couldn't be with you today.
Next, we're going to turn it over to Nicholas Sitko, who is a senior economist at FAO and one of the lead authors of the Unjust Climate. And Nick is going to present the main findings of the report. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I hope you guys can see my screen. And thank you all today for joining us. It's really my pleasure to be here to present the findings of this report on behalf of my other co-authors. So I think it's been alluded to in Maximo's introductions and Elizabeth's as well, that, so there's an emerging consensus coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that really highlights the fact that people's vulnerabilities to climate change can be very distinct and very diverse, and that these differences are rooted in long-standing persistent disparities in socioeconomic conditions, as well as these historical legacies of marginalization and inequality. Now, in the most recent assessment report from the second working group of the IPCC, they argue that in order for us to transition to a climate resilient future, we as a global community need to implement and finance climate actions that are really inclusive of all people, and that also explicitly address these inequalities in climate vulnerability. However, up until now, there's really been very little evidence for us to understand the magnitude and nature of differences in climate vulnerability across a broad geography, and particularly focusing on rural places, how climate change differentially affects people based on their wealth status, their gender, and their age. And so that's what this report really sets out to, this gap is what this report sets out to fill. As has been mentioned, the data that we use in this report come from 24 low and middle income countries. Carlo later on today is going to talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to highlight a few things. Now, most of these data are household level data. So much of the analysis that we're able to do across all countries is at a household level. But for 6 or 7, depending on the questions that we're looking at, countries, we have individual level data, which allows us to look at differences at an individual level in terms of labor outcomes, as well as the plots that are managed by individuals, and disaggregate a little bit more precisely gender differences and age differences in those respects. So overall, the sample size that we're looking at is about 109,000 households. That changes depending on the particular analysis, but these data are representative of nearly 1 billion rural people. Again, we're focusing particularly on rural experiences. And as Carlo will talk about, we've merged these data in both space at a granular geographic level and time with respect to the surveys that we're looking at, with geo-referenced weather, let's say temperature and precipitation data going back over 70 years. And so bringing these two data sources together really allows us to disentangle how different types of weather events, whether they be extreme weather events or long-run changes in climate, affect people based on their social position. Okay, so before we get into some main results, I just want to quickly kind of talk about sort of conceptually how we can expect climate exposure to have differential impacts on people in rural settings. So now, of course, the most direct impacts of climate stresses, whether they be long-run changes in temperature or extreme weather events, is going to come through agricultural productivity. So decreasing yields, decreasing agricultural output, affecting labor productivity, so working in outdoor environments in extreme conditions, and the ecosystem functionality, so how ecosystems that these agricultural systems rely on become disrupted by these events. Now, of course, those direct impacts are going to ripple through and have rural economies and have indirect impacts. So they're going to affect prices of food and inputs. They're going to affect non-farm opportunities, particularly those that are tied to agri-food systems. They may lead to shifts in household structure as people migrate away. And of course, they're going to damage infrastructure. Now, these direct and indirect impacts are always going to be filtered through an individual's social position. So for example, we can expect poorer households to have fewer resources that would limit their ability to adapt to certain types of climate stresses. They may have fewer opportunities to diversify their income away from agri-food system employment. Women may face particular challenges in terms of discriminatory norms that limit their ability to control and access resources on the one hand, but then place disproportionate time burdens on them in terms of domestic and care responsibilities within households, which again may affect their abilities to adapt to climate change as well as to access non-farm employment opportunities. Now, age may have very diverse effects. So on the one hand, older rural households may have more experience. They have more resources to allow them to adapt their agricultural systems to changing climate conditions. But on the other hand, young people may have greater abilities to migrate away to diversify their income through non-farm employment. So a priori, the effects of climate stresses on age are more difficult to anticipate. So let's get into some of the key findings. So what we found in terms of the effects of extreme weather events on poor versus non-poor households is that in an average year, heat stress is contributing to a 5% relative reduction in the total incomes of poor households compared to non-poor households. And so when we monetize this across all low and middle income countries, this amounts to about $20 billion a year in income differences between poor and non-poor households as a result of heat stress alone. extreme precipitation has very similar effects, about 4.4% reduction in an average year relative for poor households relative to non-poor households, which amounts to about $21 billion a year because of the greater frequency of these. And it's not just these extreme weather events, although these are what we often think about when we think about climate effects, but long-run changes in temperatures are also altering people's livelihood opportunities, and these are different for poor and non-poor households. In particular, what we found is that with a 1-degree increase in average temperatures, poor households tend to become more dependent on agriculture. So their share of income that comes from agriculture increases much more than non-poor households. And their ability to access non-farm income decreases much more compared to non-poor households. So what that means is that as climate changes and temperatures rise, poor households are losing non-farm opportunities and becoming much more reliant on climate-sensitive agriculture, which is likely to increase their long-term vulnerability to climate change. In terms of female-headed households, what we found is that heat stress in an average year is causing an 8% reduction in the total incomes of female-headed households relative to what would be called male-headed households in surveys often. And this, to monetize these across low and middle income countries, we're talking about $37 billion per year relative reduction in income for female-headed households. Similarly, extreme precipitation, reducing income of female-headed households by 3%, amounting to $16 billion per year. Long-term increases in temperatures are also having an adverse effect. And so what we found is that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in average temperatures, female-headed households lose on average 34% more of their total income than male-headed households. And much of this is driven by losses in farm income. So highlighting really the sensitivity of agricultural systems managed in female-headed households compared to male-headed households. Now, moving beyond this kind of dichotomy of male and female-headed households and looking specifically at individual women compared to men, what we found is that in an average year, extreme weather events are causing women to work relatively more than men, so amounting to nearly an hour more per week that women work as a result of extreme weather events. And remembering that this is coming on top of an already disproportionate burden in terms of women's time in rural areas. What was interesting when we looked at plots that are managed by women compared to those managed by men is that in response to extreme weather events, we don't see very many differences in terms of the adoption of some climate-smart agriculture practices, such as use of irrigation, intercropping, organic fertilization, soil and water conservation structures. There weren't all that many differences. And in fact, in some cases, women were more likely to adopt. But despite that effort and despite the additional labor that women are putting in response to the climate, in response to extreme weather events, women's agricultural plots remain more sensitive than men's. And that can be because of a variety of reasons in terms of ability to access appropriate technologies and the like. But what we found, for example, is a 1-day increase in extreme heat is associated with a 3% reduction in the value of agricultural commodities produced on women's plots compared to those produced on men's plots. A final kind of interesting finding is with respect to child labor. And this is very closely correlated with women's labor. And it's that in response to extreme weather events, children increase the amount of time that they work relative to men or relative to prime age adults. That doesn't mean that they're working in absolute terms more, but in response to these climate stresses, they are working relatively more and amounting to almost 50 minutes more per week. So this is obviously coming at the cost of education, coming at the cost of playtime, et cetera. Finally, in terms of age differences, we found that despite the kind of common discourse around youth vulnerability to climate change, and certainly that's the case as we look into the future as the climate crisis intensifies, but what we found is that, in fact, older rural populations tend to be more sensitive to climate stresses than younger households. And so in an average year, heat stress increases the income of households headed by young people 6% relative to older households, and extreme precipitation 3%. And much of this is coming through access to off-farm employment. So younger people tend to increase their income substantially more through off-farm employment than older households. So now, despite kind of the findings that we've presented here and the increased attention being brought to this issue of inclusivity and climate actions by the IPCC, the fact remains that climate financing still largely ignores rural people and largely ignores vulnerable rural populations. So as Maximo mentioned, 3% of tracked climate financing goes to the agriculture sector. 1.7% reaching small-scale producers, amounting to about $10 billion. This is 2017, 2018, but those numbers have not improved based on more recent estimates of agri-food systems. So a real disconnect between the amount of need and the funding. Now, we also looked at the nationally determined contribution documents and national adaptation plans from the 24 countries that we considered in this study. From those, we identified 4,164 specific climate actions that were proposed in these documents by countries. Only 6% of these mentioned women, 2% mentioned youth, 1% mentioned people in poverty, and 6% mentioned farmers. So a real lack of attention to issues of diverse vulnerabilities. Now, I think what we've highlighted is that, yes, we need more funding, we need more policy attention to this, but we also need to design and implement programs that are effective at addressing diversities and vulnerability. So the report really shows that people's vulnerabilities are distinct, they're diverse, they're multidimensional, they're affecting farm and off-farm opportunities. And if you read the report, we have a lot more evidence in terms of adaptive actions and other sorts of outcomes. But so what we need are more multidimensional policy actions. And now the report again goes into more detail here, but I want to just highlight 5 key things. First, we need to think about addressing disparities in access to resources. So this means land, this means financing, this means technologies, et cetera. And so that's going to require very intentional efforts to overcome some of these structural barriers. We need to think about how we better deliver services, including climate advisory services, extension services, to people who are often left out of these systems. So that can be much more kind of gender sensitive approaches, bearing in mind people's time burdens and people's ability to participate in things. We need to think about how we can reduce risks and compensate people for losses. And so, there's a lot of evidence on the role that social protection can play in terms of enabling people to take more adaptive actions and more kind of economic risks, as well as those systems' ability to compensate and anticipate losses. So we can think about integrating social protection better into climate actions. We need to think about enabling off-farm opportunities. So that means long-term investments in education, but also thinking about soft skills, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about credit and financing. And then finally, I think we need to think beyond just material support. Although these are necessary, they're not sufficient. We need approaches that also challenge discriminatory norms. And so gender transformative approaches that bring these things out into open discussion, that come up with local solutions, are promising ways of thinking about this. So
sorry to interrupt this interesting presentation, but if you could wrap up in 1 minute.
This is the last page.
Yeah, thanks.
So just to say, we need policies that acknowledge and prioritize people and their distinct vulnerabilities, investments to address disproportionate losses, and actions to make visible social norms and historical legacies in order for us to transition to this more climate resilient and equitable future. So with that, here's the QR code if you want to access the report, and I think this will be shared with others. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation and for taking us through the results of the report. I just want to remind everyone who's watching this to please enter your questions into whatever platform you're using for Nick, and we will have some time to return after the panel discussion to ask questions of the speakers and panelists. And now we will hear from Claudia Ringler, Director of the Natural Resources and Resilience Unit at IFPRI, on how to promote gender equitable climate action. So Claudia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to FAO for this great report, and of course also CGR's contribution. We heard very eloquently that while climate change does not discriminate, those with fewer resources and agency, that is decision-making power, are also those who are most affected and who are least able to survive, which is the real meaning of to continue to live or exist in spite of danger or hardship. I think that's what we heard. In particular, we hear women, rural poor, the elderly, and sometimes even children. Yet, the way we are operating, we are placing these groups at a yet greater disadvantage by continuing to design and implement gender and poor blind policies, and by devising gender blind investments in addressing climate extreme events. We are basically increasing these inequalities further. Importantly, there are some approaches that are trying to be gender sensitive, just, and pro-poor, but even they can fail if they're designed too rushed and without adequate consultation of those that the programs are supposed to help. Nicholas already identified the key areas that we need to work on. We know that integration of poorer farmers and women in R&D innovation processes can improve their outcomes, and that climate information services can be designed by and for poorer farmers and women. We know that closing the gender digital divide, such as the gender gap in mobile internet of at least 30% in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, could reduce information asymmetries and increase awareness and adoption of practices to counteract climate extremes. We also know that traditional financial services are unlikely to reach women, and that women's grassroots organizations do reach women. But we have not changed structures, and women's organizations remain dramatically underfunded. We have extremely far to go with improving women's leadership roles in agri-food systems from the farm to the global level. And we have not made a dent on accountability in policy processes and implementation by, for example, dedicating at least 1% of project funding for monitoring the extent to which climate actions are gender responsive and achieve gender equality goals. Without working toward a real shift, structural shifts in all these areas, gender blind investments are difficult to avoid. On the positive side, there are now more and new research programs that explicitly focus on gender and resilience and a just transition, and thus are trying to work on the findings from this very important report. Just want to quickly mention too, what the CGR program on climate action that is being drafted right now has 5 research areas that are trying to really work, I guess, on the findings of this report. One area focuses on understanding and addressing the root causes of climate injustice. So, the structural changes, I think, that Nicolas suggested. A second area focuses on reducing trade-offs and strengthening synergies for just climate action. An example here would be that women farmers who are particularly affected by mitigation in livestock, for example, which is obviously the key contributor from the production sector, they're not currently being consulted on livestock mitigation. How can we do this differently? The third area that the CGR program wants to work on is, of course, policy and governance. We do need this to be serious about a just and climate resilient food system. Here, the important question of how can we effectively elevate women's voices comes in. The fourth work stream focuses on financing the just transition. We heard that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the fifth focuses on data and digital or artificial intelligence for a just transition. Again, if we continue to disregard that the most vulnerable in digital approaches, if we continue to disregard the most vulnerable in these digital approaches, then we will certainly increase, and we are responsible for the increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. The second program I wanted to mention is actually an upcoming agriculture mitigation conference supported by the German Ministry of Agriculture, the CJR, and the Global Research Alliance on Agriculture Greenhouse Gases. That particular conference that will take place in October has a specific work stream on just transition in agriculture mitigation. I noted that the abstract submissions in the just transition work stream are quite limited, so which suggests we need to do more on research. in this area. But again, that research, of course, needs to be fully informed and co-designed by those most affected. And with those comments, I'll return to Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for those remarks, Claudia. And next we will hear from Carlo Azzari, who is a Senior Research Fellow in the Innovation Policy and Scaling Unit at IFPRI. Carlo will be discussing the importance and role of data in understanding the differential impacts of climate change. So Carlo, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. First of all, let me congratulate and commend Nick, Romina, and all FAO team for this excellent report with very rich analysis on the effect of climate variability and extreme shock. It was really nice to collaborate with them on this. I would also like to thank, of course, IFPRI, our IFPRI communication team, for organizing the event, all the speakers today, and you all for participating. So I would like to highlight essentially four main points on the data side. Just the importance, the role and relevance of the data, not only for this report in particular, but also for all in general, for all studies of similar types that look at the effect of climate. So I'm not sure if you can see the slides now. So first of all, the first element I would like to stress is the definition of climate change. So here we need to distinguish let's say, the overall phenomenon of climate risk into two separate categories. So the first is weather extreme on one side, on the left-hand side, and climate change on the other side. And the reason why we need to distinguish between the two is because they are related to different phenomena according to their very nature. So also to their data generating process. And so we also use two different definitions, right? So a weather extreme, you can click next. A weather extreme is a very rare or rare event, while climate change is related to a changing state of nature. And it's mostly summarized statistically by moving averages, standard deviation, coefficient of variation, let's say any measure of variability, so around the mean, so means and associated measure of variability. So for each of the two categories, then we use two different methodologies. So for extreme weather event, we use frequencies with percentile threshold methodology, where we essentially count the number of days as household has experienced a specific weather event within the empirical daily 95th and 99th percentiles using historical daily observation of rainfall and temperature, as Maximum and Nick alluded to. Essentially to identify whether we are in the presence or whether the household is experiencing a flood when precipitation exceeds the 95th percentile, drought when consecutive dry days exceed the 95th percentile of dry spell length, and heat stress when the maximum daily temperature again exceeds this time the 99th percentile. So next, then the second element that I would like to highlight today is the use of macrodata to look at heterogeneity. So only using data at the level of households, you can keep, yes, household individuals and plot, we can look at heterogeneity across different dimensions. And here for this report, 3 dimensions has been used. So gender, on the gender side of the household, individual and plot level, we know that female headship of household is not an ideal measure, what has been highly criticized. And in fact, that's why we went further and looking at individual level, so being female or not, and the plot level especially. That's something that Nick was mentioning before. So we look at plot managed, so exclusive plot management by male, exclusive plot management by female, and joint that we also kept separate. We look at age, both at the household and individual level, with 2 separate categories for household head and 4 categories for individuals. Of course, I mean, the categories, the thresholds are different because on average, the household head is older than an average individual. And then finally, we look at wealth. Again, at the household level, using poverty index. According to this poverty index, the house is classified as poor if it belongs to the bottom 25% of the distribution of the multidimensional index. So for this dimensional index, 7 dimensions have been considered: communication, asset, dwelling characteristics, access to water, electricity, sanitation, and education. So characteristics that are correlated to wealth, both from a household perspective and at a community level. And each dimension has a weight of 1/7 over the overall. Yeah, we can go next now. Then the third element that I'd like to stress here is the date of interview. As without it, it would be impossible to match the timing of the shock to and the relationship with outcome of interest at the household level. So matching the location of the shock, the timing of the shock, the exact timing with the household. This is due to the simple reason that if shocks occur after the date of interview, then they are not relevant, right? Because they can't affect the outcome of interest at the household level. While if shocks occur before, then they have, let's say, both direct and indirect effects. So the direct effects could be on agriculture and labor productivity, on environment and ecosystem, on infrastructure. Indirect effects could be on prices, livelihood, non-farm livelihood opportunities, health, that is very important, also mental health, gender-based violence, food security and nutrition, cognitive skills. So that's also due to change in household structure. So can cause change in household structure as well. And of course, the characteristics of being indirect or direct impact effects matter a great deal for both for analysis as well as, let's say, if not more importantly, for policy purposes. So finally, the fourth element to highlight is location. I call it here location, touches the advertisement, the real estate advertisement. So because as without it would be impossible, again, to match the geographical position of the households with a spatial shock. I mean, spatial is a shock. It's a specific explicit shock that is experienced by the household. And so again, their relationship with the outcome of interest. So for this report, we see that both the absence of the GPS information and the date of interview brought a sample reduction of about, so from the initial 44 countries that in rule list that Maximo mentioned, then 8 were excluded completely, and we also excluded important countries such as Mexico, for example, South Africa. An additional 8 have still been included, but at very low, let's say low spatial resolution that of course limit the spatial representativeness of the conclusion, right?
Sorry to interrupt, Carlo, but if you could wrap up quickly, we're a bit over time.
Yes,
Thanks.
Yes. Just the last part. And also another example of sample reduction is its analysis that was also used for the background as a background paper for this report that look at Africa only, where we had initially 31 countries and about 2.2 million observations representing more than 900 million individuals in Africa, but then shrank to 24 countries. So we lost 1 million observation and 300 million representative individuals, let's say. And on this, we lost this observation because of 90% of these observations were lost due to the date, to the missing data, 10% to the missing observation. So I would just like to stress the importance of these 4 elements, especially the last. So thank you, and I'll pass the floor on to the moderator. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Carlo, and thanks to all of our speakers. We really appreciate you digging into the details and providing some thoughts on some concrete actions that we can take going forward to address the inequalities that we see resulting from climate change. We're now going to turn to a panel discussion before we open up the floor for comments and questions. So please do keep your questions coming on these last 2 presentations and as we continue our panel discussion. And on the panel, we have Mansi Shah, who is a Senior Technical Coordinator and Program Manager at the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, or SEWA. We also have Faith Gikunda, who is the Communications Director of the Inclusive Climate Change Adaptation for a Sustainable Africa, or ICASA. And we are also joined by Aslihan Kes, who is a Senior Gender Advisor in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security at USAID. And so if everyone could put your cameras on, everyone on the panel, come on screen, and I will be directing the first question to you, Mansi. So one of the findings of the report is that women suffered production and income losses despite having adopted, climate smart practices at a similar or even greater rate in some cases than men, and investing in agriculture. Can you tell us a little bit about what interventions you think can help women adapt more effectively to the negative impacts of climate change in the South Asian context? So Mansi, over to you.
Thank you so much, and namaste, everyone. I would like to first of all congratulate FAO for the launch of this very important report. And I would also like to thank IFPRI for inviting me here to share the lived experience and perspectives of over 2.9 million poor women workers from the informal economy, the members of SEWA. So these women whom I represent here are the poorest of the poor and have always been largely and most severely affected victims of climate change. We saw a lot of numbers in the report, the prior speakers, Mr. Shitko and all, they explained the report. So let me just, as I try to answer your question, let me just explain what it means when we say that these women are severely affected or disproportionately affected. Let me share this by sharing a life story of one of our grassroots leader, Meena Ben Khokar, from the Kutch district. She's a small farmer having a 2-acre land on which she cultivates millet for her household consumption and for feeding her cattle. Last year, her village faced 3 disasters, one after the other. First, they faced extreme heat wave with temperatures soaring as high as 44 degrees. This led to acute water shortage for household consumption as well as for animal husbandry. The milk production reduced, leading to reduction in her income. The cost of irrigation doubled, so increase in overheads, and the smallholder farmers and agricultural laborers started suffering severe health issues such as heat stress, dehydration, UTI. With the family's income depleted, women often put health aside, and therefore these health issues exacerbate. Just as the heat wave was receding, the district was struck by a very severe cyclone, the Biparjoy, that destroyed fields, homes, and drowned cattle. Meena Ben lost her home, her cattle, and her crop. Overnight, she came on streets. And as if this was not enough, the district experienced several bouts of unseasonal rains, hails, and hailstorms, destroying the standing crops. This is not just the story of Meena Ben, but millions of poor informal sector women workers and their families. No disaster mitigation plan has accounted for the damage these cascading catastrophes cause on the lives and livelihoods of poor women like Meena Ben. Government aid and relief after disaster takes a long time to trickle down to people who in the meantime are compelled to go to exploitative moneylenders to survive, making them even more economically vulnerable. But does this mean that women like Meena Ben lose all hopes? Do they give up? Not at all. In our experience working with these women for over 5 decades, we've seen that these women themselves have taken on the role of first responders, adapters, and solution founders on day-to-day basis, using their own resources and technical know-how. Therefore, at SEWA, we, instead of developing programs for climate action, we support these women and their micro enterprises to strengthen their climate action most economically yet effectively. We do this through our campaign, the Building Cleaner Skies campaign, that focuses on 3 major aspects. 1, what has led to climate change? 2, what are its effects on the lives and livelihoods of poor women? And 3, what does it entail to build the resilience of these poor women against the increasingly frequent and intense climate shocks? Some of the initiatives under this campaign include the Green Village Initiative, where SEWA has trained a cadre of grassroots leaders to conduct, climate entrepreneurs, to conduct a household level energy planning and budgeting exercise, with where the women help grassroots rural households to identify what are the areas where they are spending most of their time and resources for accessing energy, and help them in switching to clean green energy solutions. Another such initiative under the Building Cleaner Skies campaign is extreme heat wave insurance, a parametric heat insurance pilot that women like Meena Ben piloted last year. And taking the learnings from the same, they piloted an all-weather catastrophic insurance weather product. This year's pilot included 50,000 women across 22 districts from Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Maharashtra states. And when the biting reality of extreme temperatures activated the insurance in 17 out of 22 districts, benefiting over 46,000 women enrolled with the pilot, totaling to a claim of Indian rupees 2.92 crores. Furthermore, all of the 50,000 members included in the pilot received a daily wages in cash assistance as the districts recorded temperatures over 40 degrees, which significantly impact the women. This demonstrated SEWA's proactive approach in blending financial tools with direct assistance to tackle the adverse effects of heat waves. So the success of SEWA's initiatives like the Green Village and the Catastrophic Insurance and the Climate Resilience Fund, they have shown that any aspect of climate action, be it building resilience, adaptation, or mitigation, if it is led by the women, it is one of the surest way to accelerate climate action. So some of the just 3 learnings that I would like to share from our experiences of leading the Building Cleaner Skies campaign is that
maybe we can return to some of these comments during the Q&A, because I'd like to move on and hear from some of the other panelists as well. Thank you, Mansi, for those remarks. I think it's important to remind people about the impacts of compounding shocks and stressors and how that can be even more damaging to the most vulnerable people. And I'm, really inspired to hear about the resilience of the women and their ingenuity in responding to these really extreme challenges. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Faith. Faith, I'd like to hear from you a bit more about the policy side of things. The report highlights that very few national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions actually consider the needs of different populations. And so I'd like to hear from you on, what really needs to happen for climate policies and investments to consider the differential impacts of climate change and actually take steps to build the adaptive capacities of these most vulnerable populations. Thank you. Over to you, Faith.
All right. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this great opportunity to share in this forum where we are discussing on the unjust climate and how it has affected how climate affects the most vulnerable groups, and to ensure that policies and investments target the vulnerable groups, that is including women, indigenous people, children, and the elderly. There is need to consider the different impacts of climate change and build adaptive capacities for the most vulnerable populations. And some of the examples of what needs to be done first is for intersectional data collection and analysis, where scientists have to conduct a comprehensive assessment to gender disaggregated data on how different populations are affected by climate change. What does this mean? This means that this should include factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, disability, and locality for communities living in urban and peri-urban and rural areas. The second thing that needs to be done is inclusive, tailored planning and policy making to ensure that these groups are considered during the policy making processes. We need to identify the diverse groups and stakeholders and engage them separately in the development of national adaptation plans and also the national determined contributions. We need to hear their voices and include their voices in the larger national and the global agendas when it comes to policy. The third thing that needs to happen for these groups to be considered is empowerment, because without empowerment, their voices are suppressed. So we need to ensure that we strengthen the abilities of vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change. we need to give them a platform where they can actually speak about what is affecting them and also contribute to the important discussions on the table, not speaking on their behalf, but empowering them to speak for themselves. The other very key consideration that needs to be undertaken is equitable financing, because we are all aware without financing, it's not possible for these vulnerable groups to participate even in policy or even in sharing in different platforms. So we need to ensure that climate finance mechanisms prioritize funding for projects that directly benefit the most vulnerable populations, and also promote equitable access to resources and technology. Because as we are aware, in terms of, let's say, for example, people living with disability, some of them might want to speak in these forums, they might want to be involved in the decision making, but unfortunately, you find that at times they don't have the disability aids that can enable them to do this. So through financing, we will be able to achieve this and involve them more. And finally, I would like to also mention that there is need to for advocacy and awareness. We need to raise awareness and advocate for the importance of equity and justice in climate action. We also need to mobilize support from governments, non-governmental organizations, and also international organizations for them to prioritize vulnerable populations in climate strategies. The more we advocate, the more we get the resources, the more we get to give the vulnerable groups an opportunity to participate in climate action. And by doing so, we will continue engaging in inclusivity and also having policies and strategies that are more inclusive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Faith. I think it's great to hear that. I know ICASA is very involved in bringing the voiceless into these policy processes, engaging in multi-stakeholder platforms and trying to promote, the elevation of the most vulnerable groups. So I appreciate that. I'm now going to turn it over to Aslihan Kes. Aslihan, I wanted to ask you, the donor community has a key role to play in directing resources to address climate change in equitable ways. So can you tell us a little bit about how USAID is supporting more inclusive and equitable climate actions, and whether you see any trade-offs between needing to respond quickly in times of crisis and actually being able to reach the most vulnerable groups, which might take more effort and planning on the part of the donor agencies? So Aslihan, over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to also start by congratulating the team who worked on this very important report, which presents strong, irrefutable evidence that rural, poor, and the marginalized are deeply and disproportionately impacted by climate change. And I think I'll sort of hit some of the top takeaways from the report, which has many of those, because I think it really is important for the donor community and those who drive programs and policies to take these in and then really be responsive in our investments. So first of all, while as a development community has long been speaking and calling attention to this reality, including the USAID's climate strategy, which prioritizes climate actions led by and including the meaningful participation of marginalized and underrepresented populations. As you noted, Elizabeth, I think most of the evidence came from smaller case studies, which were more localized. So what this report does is to close a significant data gap and distilling this huge amount of data to rigorously measure the extent of this impact, quantifying the economic costs driven by these income gaps that are widening along the lines of class, gender, and age. So it really speaks to many of our global sustainable development goals and achieving those goals, which takes away this disparity really takes away from. And women in particular suffer substantially greater economic losses. Again, something that the report strongly makes a case for. Just taking the long-term impact that I think Nicholas talked to, when the long-term average temperature rises by 1 Celsius, households headed by women lose 35% more income compared to others. And this is one of many ways women are bearing the brunt of climate change. As the report also shows, they have longer hours of work, which is a risk to their health. And this adds to other research that we've seen come out in the recent years, for instance, that women and girls face higher risks of gender-based violence, including child, early, and forced marriage, which impacts it changes their life trajectory, livelihoods, and well-being for next generations as well. So these negative outcomes come about because of underlying gender disparities and inequality that are in play. Women are the backbone of agriculture and play a large role in natural resource management, yet 1 in 5 women are landowners and millions are faced by limited access to critical resources and assets to help them adapt to climate change. And we also know that these disparities are driven by underlying norms, policies, and practices that perpetuate these disparities. So we can't make true headway in climate resilience and tackle poverty and food insecurity without addressing those. So that's why, on the heels of another important FAO report on the status of women in agri-food systems, USAID launched the Generating Resilience and Opportunities for Women, or the GROW commitment. GROW is directing $335 million to advance gender priorities in USAID's agri-food and water systems and climate adaptation programs. And a significant portion of this commitment, about $252 million, is through Feed the Future, the USAID, US government's global hunger initiative led by USAID. And it really focuses specifically on working with women on and off the farm in agri-food systems who, as Nicholas noted, are specifically vulnerable to climate impacts. This equates to approximately 1 out of every 4 Feed the Future dollar being focused on women in food security and climate resilience. This commitment is enabling us to deepen and scale our impact, improving women farmers' on-farm productivity and climate resilience, and to diversify to climate resilient livelihoods off the farm across the rural sector or agricultural sector. And GROW also puts a strong emphasis on gender transformative approaches, again, as noted earlier, which are addressing some of the systemic challenges that women face across the sector. So some of the GROW targets include doubling the number of women who apply climate-smart agricultural technologies and management practices. This includes irrigation and intercropping, for example, again mentioned, and also to support within a year, support 150,000 women in obtaining legally recognized and documented tenure rights to land and marine areas. Again, a foundational, asset that really builds on women's incentives and ability to invest in climate-smart agriculture. So access to financial services, again, is a critical, important priority for women to be able to, again, have the tools to sort of build their on-farm resilience and also diversify livelihoods. And we have, since the beginning of Feed the Future, prioritized access to finance as a priority. And since FY25 to FY22, US enabled access to over $1 billion in agricultural loans to women and women-owned businesses. Yet we still see a significant disparity between the financing access by women versus men, which is up to 47 cents to $1 access to men is accessed by women. So acknowledging this gap, we set an ambitious target to achieve gender parity by FY 2030, where we want to see women accessing equal value of agricultural financing per capita compared to men, which will, again, make a significant contribution to their ability to be able to build climate resilient livelihoods. Unfortunately, we also have a long way to go in gender responsive climate financing and advancing women's participation and leadership in green and blue sectors. Women and girls are powerful change agents, and this was really highlighted in the discussions during the panel. In designing and leading climate solutions for their communities. yet less than 2% of climate finance is invested through a gender lens. And as the Unjust Climate report also notes that little of the climate financing is directed to climate change adaptation and in agriculture and related investments. And a smaller fraction even goes to small-scale producers, many of whom are women. This is why USAID also recently launched the first ever public-private climate finance facility aimed at increasing access to climate finance for gender-responsive, women-led, and women-benefiting organizations, such as networks organizations, financial providers, and women-led and benefiting small and medium enterprises that are working to develop and scale climate solutions. So the Climate Gender Equity Fund, or CGEF, brings together Amazon, Visa Foundation, Reckitt, and the UPS Foundation, along with USAID, to increase grant capital available for women-led and women-benefiting organizations. And so far, the fund has secured over $20 million in funding. The first 3 organizations selected to receive these grants support climate solutions are receiving $300,000 to $500,000 grants each, and those were announced at COP28. Among them were, for example, Kiala Ventures, the Kenya-based accelerator, which supports women entrepreneurs in working in climate-smart agriculture across Africa. And then most of these grants then go to elevate other gender-responsive climate solutions, for example, through technical assistance or to seed funding, creating a multiplier effect across the continent. So just to sum up, I totally spoke mostly on gender dimensions of what came out of the report and what we are doing. But I think empowering all vulnerable, excluded, and underrepresented groups as critical leaders at the front lines of climate change is critical for our investment priorities across. And just to quickly touch on your second question, I think that is needed because even though climate change requires us to act fast and swiftly, without including these populations, our results cannot be, our achievements cannot be sustainable or really deliver for those who are most vulnerable and most impacted in a meaningful way. So I don't see a trade-off there. I see a virtuous cycle, in fact, for achieving climate solutions through inclusion and leadership of vulnerable and marginalized groups. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Asla. I want to pose one question to all 3 of you, but maybe I can open it up to all of the speakers and we can go ahead and get started with our Q&A session as well. So, you know, we've seen that this report makes a really valuable contribution to the evidence base on climate change and inequality by looking across a range of countries and social characteristics. But I'm curious to know, from your perspective, Mansi and Faith, how can research support the important work of grassroots organizations who are already seeking to improve the climate resilience of the most vulnerable food producers? So what is it, you know, how do you use research and what can research be doing more effectively to support the work that you do? And to you, Asla, I was going to ask, you know, what research and evidence gaps still need to be filled to help USAID and other donors really identify investments and actions that can effectively increase the resilience of vulnerable people while reducing inequalities. So if we could just broadly look at where the research gaps are and how these can be utilized better by groups who are actually working on the ground and the donors who are funding a lot of these investments, that would be great. And we can then open it up to the rest of the speakers as well on where they see research going and what needs to happen next. And in the meantime, while they're responding to this first question, I'd like to remind everyone to please enter your questions into the chat function of whatever platform you're using, and then we will open it up to your questions in the next round. So maybe over to you, Mansi, first, and let's try to keep these responses short, say 1 or 2 minutes each, please. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, Elizabeth. And I think research is a very important tool. But currently, what we have seen and what we have experienced is that generally research is all top down. However, to improve the research and to bring the voices of these poor, their climate action into the policy making, into the financing world, there is a need for the research to be bottom up. There is a need to involve the members, the women who are actually impacted by the climate shocks, to bring them into the research. So, and when I say we need to bring them in, it means that in design, in data collection, and in dissemination of the outcomes of the research. As Faith was sharing, there is a need for a more inclusion of these women on platforms for sharing the results, like bringing women to global platforms and share their climate action. Also, secondly, just one more point, which is that the research has to, especially when we are looking at climate change and research related to climate change, the research has to be longitudinal, because it has the impact of the climate shock. There is a short-term or immediate impact, but then there is also a long-term cascading impact on the lives of the poor, and that also needs to be looked at. And therefore, the research for the related has to be a long-term and not just focus on what is the impact, but what kind of adaptation and mitigation can help build women's resilience or bring them more visibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Pansy. Faith, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I can quickly comment on that, because as an organization that is based that operates nationally, we've used a lot of research in informing our interventions and our projects. And how research has really helped in this is that it's been providing localized gender and inclusive data and analysis. And by doing so, we are able to develop research-informed or evidence-informed interventions. The other way that we've been able to use research and how it can also help other grassroots organizations is in identifying best practices and innovative solutions. And by so doing, the grassroots organizations can borrow from what is already working and improve on it, instead of all the time going down into starting things afresh. So research can highly inform this, and not only about doing the research, but also ensuring that it's out there for the grassroots organizations to access it and use it. And also the other way research can help is by influencing policy and advocacy. From experience, we've realized that for the policymakers to actually listen to the grassroots organization, there has to be evidence in what they are advocating for. So that is very, very necessary for research to come in and support in that. And finally, research also can facilitate the access of resources and funding. This means that when research highlights on the gaps and the needs for climate resilience and efforts, then we are able to convince the funding partners or even the government to intervene in terms of even allocating funds. So research is very, very critical, and we need to actually invest so much in it so that our grassroots organizations can continue improving their work and having interventions that are informed by what is happening already. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. And can you just briefly say, from a donor perspective, what kind of research do you need to better inform the investments that you're making?
Yeah, I think, Elizabeth, we have many, I think, needs and priorities, but just to highlight, I think one of the findings of the Unjust Climate report really struck me. It was almost like a myth buster that women actually do adopt climate smart agriculture at similar rates, even sometimes higher, more than men. Yet they don't benefit from these. So there is a disconnect there, which I think could really be informed by research to understand how can we support women farmers to translate their adaptive actions into meaningful improvements in their lands. So this may mean, I think, to sort of think through social and technical innovations as bundles, or other ways we can really tackle maybe some of the more systematic issues that stand in the way of women being able to fully benefit from these technologies, or and create a more enabling environment for them to really to benefit. So this is really one of the spaces where we look to find what effective and cost-effective interventions there are that we can integrate in our programs, and scale these innovations to sort of really reach a larger number of women through our programs. And I want to also make one point on I think this priority, or this really valuable aspect of inclusive and sort of locally led research. I think it is critical, again, for research to be really useful and impactful on the ground. And I want to point to the climate innovation sprint that you are very familiar with, IFPRI and CGR Gender Platform launched in last year's COP, where over 20 diverse partners are coming together to think about solutions and innovations that would unlock some of the challenges to women in agri-food systems and build climate resilience. I think that's kind of that diversity of stakeholders around the room, speaking and learning to get from each other and advancing our understanding and solutions is what's going to get us to where we need to be. Over to you.
Thanks, Asla. So we've gotten some questions in from the audience. I'd like to ask the other speakers to please turn on your cameras. I'm going to be directing some questions to you as well. Nick, I have one question for you from, let's see, from Maganga Paulo from SIAT in Tanzania. They're wondering, how can the fight for climate change be made in a way that can exclude child labor from the agri-food system? So what can we do to protect children under the climate crisis from having to shoulder this additional labor burden? And as you said, not being able to attend school or to play and do things that children should be doing. Over to you.
Okay, great. No, thank you. I mean, I don't know how much good evidence we have on effective strategies for ending child labor. I mean, certainly there's the whole effort of getting child labor out of value chains and having kind of certification processes around that is an important initiative. But I think on the other hand, we need to think about the opportunity costs that are involved here. Why are people pulling their children out of school? What is causing them to do that? In what ways is pulling your children out of school better in the short term and putting them to work than having them remain in school? And so there's a lot that goes on in that decision, right? There's the immediate kind of economic crisis that a household faces with respect to that decision, why they're doing it. So how do we mitigate those? How do we compensate? How do we, for example, deliver social protection programs that can help mitigate that economic crisis that's causing it? But that on the other hand, you have the kind of pull factors around education, the quality of the education, the opportunities in non-farm employment, or the opportunities for employment in the long run outside of agriculture, for example. And so, on that side, we really need to kickstart economic dynamism that makes education valuable. And right now, I think in much of Africa, for example, there's a real disconnect between the education and the job opportunities. There's a lot of diploma graduates right now who are having trouble finding jobs. So there's some real structural issues around there as well. So there's no simple answer, is what I'm saying. But these are kind of issues that I think we could consider.
Thanks, Nick. We also have a question that I believe is directed towards Carlo. Carlo, the person is asking, how is the long-term average computed, the climate data that you're using for the analysis?
Yes. So the long-term average is based on the distribution of daily temperature and daily rainfall, and the time span varies according to the data source. So for daily data, we use precipitation. So we use depending on the country, we use the time span 79 to 2019. But using the other satellites, so IRA5, we use also hourly and monthly data from the 1950 to 2021 to measure total precipitation, total evaporation, and temperature. And this long-term average have been calculated not only using the 70 years of data, but using also we try different specification using different time periods. So 20 years or 20 years by 20 years. So and we saw that there was indeed an increase both again in average and in standard deviation. So the short answer is yes, the long-term temperature has been calculated again depending on the specific data. Between 1950 and 2021 and between 1979 and 2019.
Thanks, Carlo.
And we look at the distribution, as I said, of the percentile distribution, comparing the same month of the survey year, of the same month over the last 70 years or 40 years, depending on the source.
Thanks for that clarification. We have another question, which I'm going to direct to Claudia. And the question is, how do we make the cost of finance affordable and appropriate for smallholder farmers, especially women and youth, who are most impacted by climate change?
Yeah, thanks for this important question. And I think several people here can talk to that. I mean, one way that has been working quite well is to use more creative forms of collateral for purchasing assets. For example, basically going beyond land as a key collateral for getting a loan. For solar irrigation pumps in Africa, there have been some groups that are using asset-based financing, so women can purchase a pump without having bringing land in as a collateral. So the asset itself would be returned if women can't pay up. And what this particular group has also been doing is giving some financial training, updating their credit scores to adjust them more to women farmers, in terms of also their harvest, the kinds of crops they grow, etc. So it can be done. Takes a bit of time, might cost initially some additional resources, but you dramatically can widen the number of people who might be interested in, for example, purchasing a pump for adaptation or getting loans for other purposes. Then, of course, we know that women's savings groups work quite well. There has been a suggestion, including by SEVA, to provide climate adaptation funds directly to women's groups that they can then, in a rotating manner, grow. And of course, we need to increase the awareness of the gender digital gap, because we know mobile money is a great way for women to access funds if they can access mobile phones and mobile internet. And there is this very slow shift in increase in this area, but even working with men to ensure that their spouses can also access mobile phones, internet can go a long way. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. And we have another question here, which I think I'm going to direct to you, Mansi. The question is, what are the qualities of a successful rural development program to better support women and youth? I think you've already mentioned a lot of the work that SEWA is doing, but if you could say a bit more about your approach and what seems to be working, please go ahead.
Thank you. And I would reiterate what I was sharing earlier, that, some of the qualities of effective program would be that, one, it is gender inclusive. So basically, it has to be by the people, for the people, and of the people. It has to be designed by the women who are impacted by the climate shocks. It has to be implemented by them. It has to benefit these women. This will, and the second and most important aspect which I wanted to make here is that organizing is the key. Organizing women will help in strengthening their collective strength. It will what we have seen is women to women learning and knowledge sharing is a very effective tool for for the success of any program. When women talk to each other, when they see that something has worked, when they hear from other women that they are also facing similar challenges and how they have tackled these challenges, it gives them a motivation, it gives them a condolence that they are not alone, but it also gives them a motivation that if she can come out of this crisis, I can too. So any program should also include exposure visits or learning and knowledge sharing visits, so that women can learn from each other and replicate the best practices. And I would also like to add to just one more point to the previous question, which Claudia Ben had answered. All things that Claudia Ben said perfectly on the point, but just one more point, that when we are talking about the global funds, like be it the loss and damage fund or the climate mitigation fund, it should be considered as an investment, and these funds should be accessible to women and their organizations. And secondly, such investment should be locally governed, especially through women's own economic enterprises.
Thanks, Mansi. I have a question here I'm going to direct to Faith. The question is, as effective communication is crucial for responding to climate change, and we know that women are often at a disadvantage in having access to communication technology and being involved in decision-making, what steps can be taken to ensure that women are truly heard and valued, and that their opinions are taken into consideration, in the design of interventions or responses to climate change? Especially where, there are significant gender-related barriers. And I know you also work with disabled communities and trying to elevate their voices. So if you could say a bit more about how ICASA elevates the voices of women and the disabled as well, that would be great. Over to you, Faith.
All right, thank you very much, Elizabeth. As you've mentioned, communication is quite critical in addressing climate change, because this is where the conversation begins. And for the conversation to be quite effective, it needs to involve the people that are actually affected by the climate issues. We need to sit down with them at the table, listen to their stories, and also package them in a way that represents them very well. If possible, we also need to give the vulnerable groups a platform where they can speak for themselves, as compared to them telling the story and another third or second person disseminating that information. So in the case of ICASA, what we've been doing is that we have been conducting a lot of dialogues where we actually bring the women and also people with disability, basically the vulnerable groups, including the elderly, for them to tell their stories. And in instances where they are not able to speak the language of the majority, we get translators that can help them tell their stories. So we give them an opportunity to tell their authentic part of the story and have someone else translating it for the larger audience to hear them. So what we've learned with time is that the vulnerable groups actually are quite ready to be part of the solution. They are quite ready to speak about what is happening, but what is lacking is the platforms for them to share this. So I think we need to continually create opportunities and also platforms where they can tell their stories. And as I conclude, maybe I can mention a little bit on the people with disability, because currently we are quite high on giving platforms to people living with disability to tell their story and how their lives are impacted by climate change. And one of the things that we've realized is that as much as they want to tell their story, at times they don't have the disability aids that can help them tell their story. So what we are doing currently is that we are actually providing them with disability aids that can help them tell their story. We are also providing them with translators that can help in sign language. And we are also planning to do translation of the global policies and strategies into disability-friendly materials, where, for example, we have UNFCCC declarations translated into Blair that people with visual disability can be able to access, and so on. So it's speaking their language, giving them a platform, and packaging the information in a language that is disability friendly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faith. I want to thank all the speakers and all the panelists. This has been a really excellent discussion today. And before we close the seminar, I will be turning the mic over to Aditi Mukherjee, who is the director of the CGR Climate Change Impact Platform. And so Aditi, you will have the last word. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And what a wonderful webinar it was, just so rich with such insightful and important findings. So I'll take the last few minutes. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar, and thank you, FAO, for this report that is going to be the definitive report for years to come. And thank you for taking the time today. So my concluding remarks are in 3 parts. I'll try and be very brief in 3 minutes. For one, we always knew that impacts of climate change are unequal and unjust. This has been a knowledge that we have now known for 30 years at least. The IPCC synthesis report of the AR6 published last year, of which I was a part, actually says in its synthesis SPM1 that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. This has led to widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages. And vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected. So the knowledge that climate communities who have contributed the least, but within that, women, children, elderly are disproportionately affected is something we have now known for a while. And this is particularly true of some of the extreme events, and we now know that extreme events are also a part of climate change. But many of it has been kind of from much of that evidence has come from case studies. For example, we have known that when it comes to early warning in the context of floods, women often do not receive those early warnings. And even if they receive those early warnings, they are not in a position to act on them. As a result, in the floods scenario, for example, we find that there are more mortality among women and young children than among males. So it's not as if this wasn't known, but for me, the most exciting part of the report was that twofold, that it quantifies using a representative data, because much of the knowledge that we had were coming from case studies, very valid, very good methodology, but nonetheless, region-specific case studies. So I think here the 2 important additions are that it quantifies using representative data, and it also clearly identifies the pathways through which these disproportionate impacts happen. And that is very important because it leads us to ask questions like, so what can we do about it? What can we do about those disproportionate impacts? And I think that opens really exciting pathways for us to take action. So that's coming to my second part then, what can we do? Some of the thoughts that I was having as I listened to all the panelists and the speakers. For me, the important question is, therefore, how can we frame adaptation and resilience building initiatives in ways that understands the differential impacts and designs those to reduce those impacts? So we heard from our panelists that many of them touched upon how those programs might look like. For example, our speaker from SEWA talked about the need for locally led adaptation measures program designed by the women for the women. We heard about co-design, and we heard about mentions by various speakers about those that target the root cause of vulnerability. So basically what our next step is, now that we know that the impacts are disproportionate, which by the way, we have known for a long time, this report quantifies it really nicely. The question is, how do we take action to make sure that those disproportionate impacts are actually targeted through interventions. And then following that, how do we know that those interventions were successful in reducing those disproportionate impacts? So I think that's a lot of work that needs to happen in that region around designing programs and policies to tackle those disproportionate impacts. This brings to my final reflection, which something I thought I did not hear enough, perhaps, is that the disproportionate impacts are not at all accidental. They are, of course, the result of structural inequity. In this case, when it comes to gender, result of millennia of patriarchal structures that perpetuates those inequality. So we have to literally look beyond immediate climate action, and we need to keep working on dismantling those inequitable social structures. In this context, patriarchy, but in the wider context, there are colonial histories, there is a history of racism. We also know that people of color are disproportionately affected. We know that from the hurricane impacts that happened in the US and in many other parts of the world. So, and we have to therefore look at the historical enablers of those inequity. So technical interventions are certainly very important. We at the CGIAR work on them, but we also work on the policy interventions. So technical interventions like how do we design solar irrigation pumps, which are useful for women, are super important, but not enough by itself, unless we think of structural changes that needs to happen. And eventually we think around dismantling some of these inequitable structures that perpetuate the inequity. So those were kind of my thoughts, like tackling the root causes of vulnerability and going beyond the socio-technical kind of interventions to more ones that is actually asking those hard questions around the structural inequities that we find. And climate change is simply exacerbating some of those inequities. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and it was a great webinar. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Aditi, and thanks again to all of our speakers and panelists and to our audience for tuning in today. I also want to thank the IFPRI events team for helping us put this event together, and we hope to see you at the next seminar. Have a great day, everyone.